So let's use this as a chance to review a few key points of the introduction to skeletal system. So as always, we do have a lot of material that we're going to go through. I believe that in a face-to-face class, we'll probably break down the content from this video in a few different sessions. But regardless, I'm recording it all as one for us for today to have a reference of in case you ever miss any of the lectures. So I wanted to start by discussing about the origins of human skeleton. Human skeleton starts as a cartilage, and this cartilage then gets replaced by bone in a process known as ossification. And we end up saying that the areas where a high amount of flexibility is needed still remain cartilaginous. And there are different kinds of cartilages that we could look at that we end up finding in the body. So we're going to see hyaline cartilage. That's the most common of these cartilage types, and it's only made of collagen fibers. We end up finding hyaline cartilage at our joints, at the costal cartilages of the ribs, at the larynx and trachea, and also at the nose tip. We're also going to see elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is made of elastic fibers, and we end up finding that that includes, for example, our external ear and our epiglottis, so that little flap-like structure at the voice box region. We also have a fibrocartilage tissue. This is made of thick collagen fibers, and we end up seeing here high tensile strength. That's very characteristic for this cartilage types. And for example, the meniscus of the knee would be a good example of where we see fibrocartilage, and we also see that at the vertebral discs. On this picture, the fibrocartilage would be indicated on red color, the elastic cartilage on green color, and hyaline cartilage on blue color. So let's talk a little bit about the functions of the skeletal system. Well, first of all, skeletal system provides us kind of the scaffolding or the framework for the body. So most of the other systems build up on this. So if you think of an analog to a construction business, they have those scaffoldings outside the building as they're building the structure. So that's the role of the skeletal system. It provides for everything else in the body, the framework to build from. We also end up seeing that skeletal system serves an important role of protecting many soft organs. So, for example, we see that the skull protects the brain inside it. We see spinal cord being protected by the vertebral column, and then vital organs like heart and lungs being enclosed inside the rib cage. So a lot of protective functions that we see there. Skeletal system is also very important for the production of movement. So we'll end up seeing later on when we first cover the skeletal system, then we move on to discuss muscular system. And we end up seeing that these two systems really work in uniform. So the skeletal muscles typically attach to bones, and they typically attach to bones so that they cross a joint. And as the muscle constricts, the angle of the joint decreases, and as the muscle relaxes, we can see that the angle of the joint increases. So really, the skeleton is needed for the skeletal muscles to do their job to allow the movement to take place. Rather interestingly, this is something that not all students always think about, but skeleton is also very important as a storage location for many things like calcium, but also salts and minerals in our body. We also end up seeing that blood cells end up being produced at the bone marrow. And this is especially relevant again when we think of patients who, for example, would have clinical issues and, for example, would need a bone marrow transplant. This would be often because their bone marrow is no longer functional or present, so we have an issue then with the production of the blood cells as a result. We also end up seeing that skeleton plays an important role when it comes to the fat being stored in the internal bone marrow cavity. So another function for that. And the final function that I have listed on this slide relates to the role of skeletal system in regulation of the hormone production. So a lot more to the skeleton than students often end up thinking initially. Let's talk a little bit about how we can divide skeletal system into different parts and in different ways. And let's start with the division classification of dividing the skeletal system and parts of the skeleton in two groups based on their location. So the first location that we're going to see is the bones that form the axial skeleton. So this axial skeleton really forms the long axis of the body, and this includes, for example, the skull, vertebral column, and the rib cage. All of these structures protect the really vital organs that we have in the body. So often some of my previous classes, we have discussed how human body is kind of cylindrical in shape when it comes to the axial skeleton and how we end up seeing that the vital structures are protected a lot with those bony structures. In addition to the axial skeleton, we also do have appendicular skeleton. An appendicular skeleton contains the bones of the upper limb and the lower limb, and also the girdles that attach limbs to the axial skeleton. And I often discuss about appendicular skeleton with my students by talking when you apply, for example, for a specific job or a grant, you might have the actual application document, but then you attach appendixes to that document. So appendicular means that it's not necessarily like the main bulk, but it's an additional part. So you could consider upper and lower limbs as additional parts to the axial skeleton. What's noteworthy is to notice the transition parts. These are the bones that students often struggle most when trying to separate which parts are axial, which parts are appendicular skeleton. So what belongs to the appendicular skeleton includes your scapula, so your shoulder blade, your clavicle, so your collarbone, and also the hip bones. So pay attention to those transition points. Those are the ones that students often kind of struggle a little bit when trying to draw that line. What's part of axial? What's part of appendicular? And I think that the picture that you have there is a particularly good one and hopefully will help you. But there's other ways of classifying skeleton and classifying especially bones. And we can classify bones according to four shapes that they might have. So the first example that I have here is bones that are classified as long bones. These are especially the limbs of the body. So long bones are typically longer than they are wide. And we end up seeing that they have the shaft portion and then enlarged end parts. And some of the examples that I can think of that would be good examples of long bones would be, for example, your femur and your humerus. Let's talk a little bit about short bones. Short bones are often cube shape-ish or approximately cube shape. A good example again that I could think of would be, for example, our patella, so our kneecap, or our carpal bones that form the wrist, or tarsal bones at the ankle. The third group that I have here for classification of bones based on their shapes is the bones that are considered as flat bones. These are thin, flattened, and often curved bones. And for example, the bones of the skull could qualify as flat bones. I think ribs would be good examples of flat bones. Your sternum, so the chest bone, and your scapula, again, the shoulder blade, would be good examples of flat bones. And final group that I have for us to look at is what classifies as irregular bones. I often think of this kind of as a catch-all group for bones that do not fit into other categories. So these bones are often irregular in shape. Good examples would be, for example, your vertebrae or even your hip bones. I do want, though, at this point to acknowledge that sometimes it might be unclear that where do the bones actually really fit into this classification to four shapes. It's not a perfect classification system, but it's a system that's fairly commonly used, so I wanted to introduce that to you. Moving onwards, let's have a look of another way of classifying bones. We can also classify bones based on the structure, and we end up seeing that the structure of the bones varies at different parts of the bones. So within the same bone, we can see two types of structure. We can see compact bone and we can see spongy bone. Compact bone is this dense, smooth, solid, homogeneous, and often kind of forming the outer layer of the bones. This is very, as a material, very durable and very strong. Spongy bone instead is formed of microscopic small needle-like pieces and open space that are kind of intertwined. And spongy bone is often found inside of the bones. And one of the functions of spongy bone is that it still provides that structure while reducing the overall weight of the entire bone. Now what I wanted to do next is to have a look of long bones. And we're going to look at different parts of the long bone. So let's discuss that a little bit further. So when we look at the long bone, we can divide it in many different ways. And we're going to start with the division to diaphysis and periosteum. So diaphysis is the shaft part of the long bone. So this makes up most of the bone's length and is composed typically of the compact bone. Periosteum is a term that refers to the outside covering of the diaphysis. So this is fibrous connective tissue membrane, and we end up seeing that there are perforating fibers that will secure it to the underlying bone. So kind of a layer around diaphysis. Let's have a look of two other terms, epiphysis and articular cartilages. So epiphyses are the ends of a long bone. These are mostly made of spongy bone and a thin layer of compact bone around it. And we can often separate the epiphyses into proximal epiphysis and distal epiphysis. Again, remember those terms that we learned when we discussed about anatomical directions. We also see articular cartilage covering most external surfaces of the epiphysis. These are made of hyaline cartilage. And the main function of these articular cartilages that I want us to focus at this point is to decrease the friction at the joint surface, so we don't have bone rubbing against another bone, but rather this articular cartilage connective tissue layer that does that job. Two other terms, endosteum and medullary cavity. So let's talk about endosteum. So this lines the inner surface of the shaft and it's made of connective tissue. And medullary cavity is the cavity inside the shaft. In adults, this typically contains yellow bone marrow, which is mainly fat. And in infants, I would say up to the years of 6 years or 7 years of age, this contains also the red bone marrow for blood cell formation. There's another way of looking at the bone and bone tissues, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the microscopic structure of the bone. And we end up seeing really three main types of the bone cells. Not all bone cells are the same. And I want to review the osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. So osteoblasts are bone cells that are responsible for secreting matrix of new bone. And we end up seeing that these osteoblasts work very much in a way that they secrete the new bone around themselves. And as they keep secreting more and more new bone around themselves, you can almost consider it as this osteoblast getting trapped inside its products. So now osteoblast turns into osteocyte. These are mature bone cells. And even though these osteocytes are trapped inside the bone matrix that they've secreted around themselves, they still do have these arm-like structures to reach out. And they're responsible for the maintenance of the bone. An analog that I often give to my students is that if you think of osteoblasts working, producing that new bone around themselves, it's almost like you would be mopping the floor immediately around yourself, and eventually you'll end up seeing yourself trapped inside. So there's really nowhere for you to go without stepping on newly mopped floor surface. So that's when you would become osteocyte. I wanted to talk about osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are responsible for reabsorption and breaking down the old bone. And the reason why I really wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about these three main types of bone cells is that I want to really emphasize that bone is very much a living tissue, and there's constant interplay of making new bone and breaking down old bone. So these cells are working kind of in an interplay. For osteoblasts to be able to make new bone, we must also remove old bone with the osteoclasts. So there's a constant process of interplay of these three cell types. And I think nowhere else do we see it as well as we look at in this picture, where we see that actually the bone can change its shape over time based on its needs. So often I talk to my students about the need of having physical stress exposed to a bone, and that will actually strengthen the bone. I'm not talking about huge exercise, but jogging, things like that, light exercise will actually strengthen those bones that are exposed to that slight impact. And that will literally cause the bone to break down and build new bone in a way that supports the bone to last that stress. Let's continue our discussion of the microscopic anatomy of the physiology of the bone. And let's start by looking at the microscope image that I have at the bottom of this slide, where we see a really nice section of the bone tissue. And we can see a few structures there. Let's start with the lacunae. These are cavities in the bone, and these are what house the osteocytes. Remember, osteocytes were the mature bone cells. Then we have also concentric lamellae, these rings around the central canal. And these are concentric circles of lacunae situated around the central canal, which is also known as Haversian canal. Let's highlight here on this picture the central canal, also known as Haversian channel that I just mentioned. So this is an opening in the center of an osteon. And this runs lengthwise, so vertically, if you wish, through the bone and carries things like blood vessels and nerves. Osteon instead, which is known sometimes as a Haversian system, is a unit of bone. So it would be all that we're seeing on this slide as this kind of larger circular pattern of structures building together. This contains a central canal and also the matrix rings around it. And like I mentioned, this is the structural and functional unit of compact bone. We are seeing one osteon on this cross section, kind of extending almost from all corners of the picture that we're being seen, this whole round shaped structure. A couple of other microscopic structures that I want to highlight here for us. Canalically, these are tiny channels that radiate from the central canal to the lacunae. These form a transport system connecting all bone cells to a nutrient supply. And we can also see perforating canal, Volkmann's canal, in other cross sections. It's not visible on this one. This is a canal that would run at 90-degree angles, so horizontally in a different direction from what we saw earlier on. So 90-degree angle of central canal. And this carries blood vessels vessels and nerves to that direction. But what we end up seeing, as we will in our next video and in our next classes go through the different bones of the body, is that just knowing the different bones and names of these different bones is not enough. I next have 4 slides of bone markings for us to discuss about, and we will become more familiar with these bone markings as we study those bones in the future. So this is more of just an introduction. But when I'm talking about bone markings, I'm typically talking about things like attachment sites for muscles, tendons, or ligaments. Bone markings can also be passage locations for nerves or blood vessels. And what I have here on this first slide is a collection of bone marking terms that we might see when we discuss about projections and processes. So these grow out from the bone surface, and the name often starts with T. When we see depressions and cavities, these are indentions of the within the bones, and the name often starts with a letter F. And here I have projections that help to form joints, and I'll let you study those independently, and we'll root back to those again when we look at those individual bones and review of that later on. And here I have a selection of terms that relate to the depressions and openings. So these are really for passage of blood vessels and nerves, especially, that we're seeing here listed. And I have a few other depressions on this slide. Again, I'll let you study them independently, and we'll revisit these as we review the individual bones. And what I wanted to do next was to shift our thinking a little bit away from this kind of a review of the bone markings. And I want to talk a little bit about the homeostasis of the bone. So earlier on, we saw that bone growth is controlled by stress that the bone is exposed to. Like I mentioned, there's constantly some bone tissue that's broken down and some bone tissue that's rebuilt. But we see that also hormones play an important role in this process. And the examples that I wanted to mention here would be, for example, growth hormone and sex hormone. And bone is remodeled throughout your life in response to 2 factors that I want to talk about. So the first factor that I want to talk about is the calcium ion level in the blood that determines when bone matrix is broken down or formed. So we need to have a sufficient amount of calcium for this process to take place. If we do not have sufficient amount of free calcium or accessible calcium, this process of bone remodeling will not take place. The other factor that I wanted to talk about is a pull. And this could be either due to the gravity or through muscles pulling on a bone. This pull on bones determines where the bone matrix is broken down and formed. So again, we're seeing kind of this interplay between kind of more, if you want to think of it more as a chemical basis and physical basis that determines the bone remodeling. And this process takes place, like I said, throughout the lifetime. I wanted to talk a little bit about the calcium ion regulation, since that's so important. And this is where parathyroid hormone, that is often abbreviated as PTH, comes into play. So parathyroid hormone is released when calcium ion levels in blood are low. And this hormone activates osteoclasts, so those bone-breaking cells. And as osteoclasts break down the bone, they release calcium ions into the blood so that it's now available. And from a clinical perspective, this could lead to clinical issues, and we could see, for example, that parathyroid hormone could be making bones very brittle, or we could see that hormone calcitonin would make bones stronger. So some common disorders of the skeletal system is kind of what I was planning to wrap up this session with. And let's start by looking at bone fractures. So a bone fracture is basically a break in the line of continuity of a bone. And there's many ways of classifying the fractures, and really the way we classify the fracture that will have an impact on the treatment plan that we'll choose. So we can see simple, or what's sometimes referred as closed fractures. Here the bone ends are aligned manually, and then they are just casted or wrapped to secure that they stay together aligned nicely. We can also have compound, or what's known as open fractures. Here we see that surgical repair with pins, screws, and bars might be needed. But there are other ways to classify bone fractures as well. We won't, on this course, get to review them in too much of a detail, but if you're interested, I'm always happy to discuss them further with you. Things like green stick fractures in younger patients are especially common. I'm going to talk about another pathological condition that relates to the skeletal system. So let's have a look at osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is a condition where we have decreased bone density, and that then leads to having fragile bones, which makes one more likely to develop fractures. And osteoporosis impacts older adults and especially women. And we see here the role of estrogen as a protective role against osteoporosis. So postmenopausal women are especially in a risk of osteoporosis. That's why in females, we really try to make sure that we strengthen that skeletal system, that it's strong before they hit the menopause. Other issues that we see commonly with osteoporosis is the vertebral column has a chance that it might collapse, and this gives that characteristic hump-like appearance on individuals who are dealing with osteoporosis. Obviously not on all, but on some. I wanted to mention a couple of other conditions. I wanted to mention rickets and osteomalacia. Both of these conditions are conditions where bones soften and become weak. And we see, especially in children, that the lack of vitamin D would be one of the causes, and this impacts calcium homeostasis. And we see things like delayed growth and other symptoms. The treatment for this could be vitamin D and or calcium supplements. And that really brings me to the end of this kind of I will admit, a quick review of a lot of material we have covered in terms of the skeletal system. I know it's been a lot. In our next sessions, we will go through the skeleton bone by bone. And finally, we will finish off by talking about articulations. Obviously, I also have some labs for us to look at. But this is a good point for us to wrap up today. Thank you for joining.